This isn't the first time that we've seen sensitive, classified information that's been leaked. More often than not, it's usually been, sadly, the United Kingdom, whether it be leaving laptops on trains or in cars that have been broken into, or messages that have been sent to the wrong recipients. But certainly in this instance, what is quite fascinating is supposedly and allegedly by the Atlantic magazine that an individual, a journalist, was joined to a particular confidential group, messaging group, on Signal, which is a open source, secure messaging app, which any one of us can download from the web, and that there was not a higher or greater level of security around a messaging app, which would ensure that it only whitelisted specific individuals. Because we've all made that mistake where we've sent a message to someone accidentally and then inevitably deleted it or recovered from the embarrassment sometime later. But where the biggest concern is that the US is not using for these top level individuals within Donald Trump's cabinet, but also within the military. They're not using their own proprietary secure messaging means to ensure that only those that should be receiving this information are receiving it. The one most important element that when you are holding, passing, discussing any kind of classified, highly confidential or strictly confidential information is what we term as OPSEC, operational security. And how that information is handled, created, stored, and ultimately disposed of has to be considered incredibly carefully because the leak of this type of information, particularly to someone who may be a journalist, who may feel obliged in the public interest to publish it, obviously undermines the credibility of not only that particular mission or that objective, but also the credibility of those that are handling this type of information. And what is quite astounding in this particular instance is the levels of individuals of seniority in Donald Trump's administration who all got involved. And when we were joined into this group and didn't question who else was in that group. And let's use a very typical common garden day-to-day example. If we get joined into a WhatsApp group, for example, amongst our friends, more often than not, we will immediately go and review who else is in that group. Who else is there? Is it someone that we know? And we may choose then either to stay within that group or maybe even just leave that group because there are people in there that we wouldn't necessarily want to share information with, we don't know, or for that matter, we don't want to have our telephone number. And the problem with the Signal app is that all the personal telephone numbers of individuals would have been demonstrated or shown, certainly within the group user list. And there are other secure messaging apps out there, Threema being one example, that provides that convenience, that ability to be able to communicate with other people, but you can conceal and hide your identity a great deal more than, for example, Signal, which is in many regards highly secure and very good. But again, it's always going to be down to that human user error that leaves it vulnerable to these kinds of risks. There are two major repercussions that will result in the wake of this somewhat tragic and comedic failing by high-level members of the cabinet in sharing sensitive, classified, military-based intelligence. And the first of which is that it will show to their enemies the kind of lapses in security that could potentially happen, and also the platforms that they are potentially utilizing for communicating at this high level. And that would bring some serious question marks, as it would with me and any other security professional, as to why they're not using some vetted, whitelisted, proprietary, secure messaging means to communicate information like this. The second thing is Donald Trump, how he is handling this. Now, he is shirking it off. And as much as we have great respect for President Donald Trump, this is not a matter that should be treated lightly or considered lightly in terms of how his cabinet is being regarded and the security instruments that they're using by the greater world, and especially the enemies. So I think that a slightly more serious approach should be considered in terms of an inquiry and investigation as to how this happened, but also clear address to the procedures and protocols that should be in place for all of these individuals to say fundamentally, this is not a means of communication you should use. And that is, again, no different on a normal level to employees within a company who will be told that they cannot use their corporate devices, their laptops, their tablets, their phones to access their social media. Because again, the introduction of viruses, the introduction of ransomware, of exploitation types of hacks could be utilized on an open source platform like Signal, and one should never discount that. And supposedly the USA, with the power of the NSA, surely has the tools to ensure that something like this shouldn't be happening. Well, when we consider the United States is part of the Five Eyes coalition of intelligence sharing countries, which obviously includes Canada, the United States, of course, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand. Certainly to those allies, they will be asking some serious questions as to what other information, unreported, may have got into the public domain. And certainly if they're using this means of communication, which is why this needs to be treated incredibly seriously and why President Trump needs to address his staff members and talk to them all and communicate to them all that this is not the way that you share sensitive information. It's fine if you're talking about your social plans. It's fine if you're talking amongst your friends and you want to use a heightened level of security over above many other general messaging apps. But it's certainly not the medium or the platform to utilize to sharing war plans.
It is really, really concerning. Now, obviously, it's got tremendous headlines because of what it said and because who's on it, the vice president, defense secretary, President Trump's envoy to Ukraine, all involved in ceasefire negotiations at the moment. And also what was actually said and been published with the US Defense Secretary saying he's fed up of bailing out pathetic Europe, and it's about time that Europe started looking after itself, and other commentary as well. I'm on a number of Signal groups, and some of them are in the sort of security and military space, but everybody knows that Signal is not secure, and most of us ditched it. We Signal is generally used as an administrative communications network. Most people now even use, something like Twitter, which is end-to-end encrypted, is far better. And why is it a concern that that Signal is so insecure? Well, we understand that when this Signal group was set up, Steve Witkoff, who is the US envoy to Ukraine, was actually in Moscow at the time, speaking to Putin. And that is naivety on an incredible scale, because he should have known, I'm sure he would have known, that all his electronic devices would be scanned by the Russian Secret Service, the FSB, the GRU if it was out of Russia. So anything on his phone would be the knowledge of the Russians, which, that is one point. But also when we know that when Steve Witkoff was interviewed by the Russian-leaning Carlson the other day, he said that he was rather fond of Putin and supported a lot of what he did. So when we're relying on the Americans to negotiate a ceasefire, and we see things like this hitting the press, psychologically, for those of us in Europe, it's a bit depressing, and more importantly for the people in Ukraine, really depressing, and it gives a fillip to Putin, who even today his team negotiating a ceasefire in Saudi with the Americans, the Russians are now saying they want even more territory that they don't even own before they even think about peace. So, and again, reinforces the view that the Russians, or certainly President Putin, thinks he's winning in Ukraine and has no desire to stop. And if he knows that the American negotiators, are chatting behind everybody's backs or behind European backs, and actually, seeming to favor Moscow rather than Europe, it puts everybody in a really bad position. And the final bit on this is it also illustrates some of the challenges you have when you have people put into political and diplomatic positions who are untrained or do not have the experience for the role. Steve Witkoff, I understand, is a property developer by design. Pete Hesketh, the American Defense Secretary, was a junior military officer and has been a TV personality since. So, maybe they don't realize that they are making these sort of security blunders. And if they weren't, looking after the most powerful military in the world or trying to negotiate a peace with a tyrant like Putin, we wouldn't be that worried. But because they are, it has a profound ripple effect across the world and particularly here in Europe. I think the most concerning part is that this might sound bizarre, that it hit the media. If this was happening, between you and I or people who are not in such position, you can make mistakes and that's fine. But we're not going to make mistakes that could potentially cost lives. And that is the worry here. And although, on the face of it, it's just words, but it's psychology. And ambiguity and inconsistency in warfare, are really challenging. It might be great when you're doing business deals, but basically, when you're telling your enemy, and we have to assume that still Putin is the enemy of the United States, when you're telling your enemy what you're going to do and what you're not going to do, it gives them such an advantage, which is why I hype back to negotiations going on in Saudi at the moment. Suddenly Russia wants more. It shows no signs of stopping. And we're just hearing of some horrific attacks yesterday on hospitals and schools and overnight. And, Russia is certainly not taking its foot off the military gas in Ukraine. And although it's the war in Ukraine, the other side of the Atlantic probably looks very different. But here in Europe, it's incredibly worrying and incredibly serious. And nobody who studied this in any detail thinks that Putin will stop at Ukraine. And that's why we here are jumping up and down, incredulous that that the most powerful men, predominantly in the world, are talking so openly about what they're doing and what they think of Europe, who, we're all part of NATO and they are supposed to be our allies. But at the moment, our ally seems to be in our enemy's camp. We've seen that Putin, although an evil tyrant, is a master strategist and is pretty much running rings around the Americans at the moment. Well, I say the Americans, the new Trump administration. He had two key aims when he invaded Ukraine back on the 24th of February 2022. Firstly was to subjugate Ukraine and bring it back into Russia. And the second was to decouple Europe from the US. And you read these messages and you would sort of think that he's pretty much achieved his second aim, because it would appear that the American administration have a very dim view of us lot here in Europe. And if we look over the pond now, we have to assume that the Americans are not going to come galloping across the Atlantic to help us if Putin, steams further west across Europe.